presentation. We now invite Professor Ruth to take on the candidate.
Thank you.
Yes.
I don't want to go and stand up there. Andre, you've done the hard work already. Bonjour and merci beaucoup.
Okay, thank you, bonjour.
I will switch to English because my French is terrible, but I should congratulate you on overcoming the language barriers because it's really impressive. If we could give you a PhD in language skills, then we would. So fortunately for all of us, I know a little bit more about evidence-based policy than I do French. So before we start, I just wanted to thank Professor Samankambo for bringing me here and for his team for making such good arrangements. Alan, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but I had an empty seat on the aeroplane and your thesis was spread so that I could come up with some questions. So I have lots of scribbles. I'll try and keep track of my comments. It's a long thesis and I know that I'm going to jump around a little bit, so bear with me. I've supervised a number of PhDs and examined a number too, and I was really impressed by your PhD, so congratulations. I'm supposed to be your opponent. People keep telling me I'm the main person. I have to admit I think you're the main person. And I consider my job to be to ask you questions, sometimes challenging, but my goal is to allow you to shine. So I'm not here to catch you out, play tricks. You've done the hard work, and I hope this is your chance to tell us more about it. Somebody said to me in my own PhD examination, it's a bit depressing, but this might be your last chance to really talk about your PhD. So enjoy it. Okay. Oh, the other thing was just to say, if you don't understand my questions, please ask me. Your English sounds very fluent to me, but don't get stuck on a language question. So I noticed you're not a traditional academic, but I think in knowledge translation, that's a very good thing. I've worked in academia for 20 years, and I've had 2 years out to work in the real world, and I've probably learned more in those 2 years than I did in my time in academia. So, and I think in this field, which is about spanning boundaries, it's extraordinarily valuable to be able to do that. So you may feel more of a novice in academia than you do in your health ministry job, but actually that's a strength. So I just wanted to start off by asking you that, why did you set out to do this work? Because it's a courageous thing to go from one field, one area of work where I think you're probably more familiar, into an academic role, which is not so easy, especially given the language barrier. So why did you set out to do this? Can you tell us?
Okay. To be honest, this process has been, the project theme involved me because of a relative similar thing that I was doing under the national health accounts in the health system, because I was keeping track on how people were using the data that we're producing every year for policy making. So, keeping the record and communicating with them, and supporting them instead of letting them read in the report, because what we realized, oftentimes they don't read. We produce the health account report, but they don't read them. So to facilitate the process, we ask them to not read it, but just send us questions, and then we'll respond it to them. So then when they started the project implementation, so they were looking for someone doing similar work, to involve in the project process, and then start doing the same thing. So that's how we started, and then the topic now has been something that we discussed with the supervisor to retain it.
Thank you. Which leads me nicely to my next question. Because you have 3 supervisors, and certainly in my environment that's quite unusual. And I know the esteemed colleagues you have supervised you in their work, and I think it's really challenging to negotiate amongst different supervisors sometimes, especially when you know their experience and you admire their work. And I think, so I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit, but I want you to tell us a bit about where your work comes through in this, above and beyond what your supervisors guided you. You talked a little bit about your role and your ability to choose cases, things like that. When we read your thesis, where's your voice the most strong, if you like?
I would say starting from the unit implementation itself, and also, you know, understanding how we could do the institutionalization analysis itself, because probably someone would have directly studied the units itself to understand the component for on how we could institutionalize it. But what I did, my proposition was that to look at existing units and understand first how they usually create a unit and introduce it in the health system, and second, learn from existing units on how they could, we could understand those unit institutionalization in the process. And also because, you know, I was involved on the different work with the World Health Organization on institutionalization activities. So therefore it was, you know, easy for me to imagine on how we could proceed to analyze and understand the unit institutionalization. Second thing that I could highlight is that, you know, at the time we propose the ideas, we have to convince the supervisor that we have to go to work like that. So, and then, you know, we have to convince them and come up with the ideas. So understanding the whole flow and how they are linked together, I remember it was a long discussion with Nelson, because he wanted me to explain how these three studies could fit together so that we could understand the flow. Because when I'm talking about the unit institutionalization, someone will ask me, why am I studying creating a unit in the health system? So by the time it could inform the unit institutionalization regarding how government usually interact, how they discuss and how they manage to introduce this in the health system, is something that, you know, I have to provide and convince them to work through.
Thank you. So your role is really special, and I couldn't have done this PhD, and I don't think your supervisors could have either. We didn't have the open doors or the understanding of what's happening in the ministry. And you talk a little bit in your thesis around the challenge, both a strength and a weakness of your participant observer role, of the fact you're so involved. And I wondered if you could, so I would challenge your idea that you're objective. I would do a different approach. I would say you're not objective, you're subjective, because you know so much. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the biases that you think you might have introduced in your role. Not necessarily that they're bad, but that there are biases particular to your involvement in this work.
Okay. First, I think on studies 2, for example, the way I selected the second units that failed to be institutionalized, you know, was based on my own understanding of the health system. But someone could have, and I remember my supervisor in Burkina told me that I don't have to study this unit because these units really don't exist at all in the system. It's in the framework, it's there, there's a space for him, but there is no activity carried out in the health system. But I told him that that's why we would like to understand what it is. So I have to, it could have been probably a bias because I decided to retain that unit, but at the end, we had some, we've learned a lot from that unit that could, you know, improve other unit institutionalization in the health system. The second thing that I could, you know, highlight is, you know, as a participant observer, you know, have to interact with being able to identify some of the key players in the health system. And because this is, you know, talking about something really sensitive, you know, when you discuss with them, because we have close relationship and we used to work together, it's easy for them to, you know, talk to me and then at the end tell me that no, you cannot transcribe this, although the information is important. You know, sometimes they say don't talk about it in your paper, but you know, I managed to, you know, to transcribe some of them and make sure that it doesn't appear clearly to them. so that they don't complain later. Because, and I also remember the second paper when I sent the draft to Professor Nelson and he read it. I think he's the one who told me to anonymize the second unit because there is a problem inside, and it could have been really difficult for me if they read about it. And I remember Professor Nelson delaying the whole process because of he wanted me to show that I had analytical approval for this study, which, to be honest, I didn't get before. So I had to stop everything and make sure that I get the approval for all the 3 studies together before I start moving forward with the process.
Thank you. Let me see where my scribbles go next. So, if we look at your methods and your analytical frameworks, I found it really interesting, the framework that you developed, and also the Kingdom one that you started with, which I'm a bit more familiar with. And so I think there's a problem with, or challenge for all of us doing research, and I want to ask you about it, which is that when we set up a framework and go and have a look for something, we find it. We find it partly because we started off saying, let's go and look for it, and then we find it. So I was wondering a little bit about to what extent, particularly in your first study, to what extent you found what you were looking for because you were looking for it. Whether or not there were any surprises that came out, or whether actually that first study was very predictable.
I think looking at, first I started by using the III framework for the study analysis. And then when I started the process, I've been told that if I have to use the framework, the III framework, I have to study the whole process, which is a long process, and it was true that I would not get the whole data. So that's why we moved for Kingdom framework, and then also just keep the agenda setting part of that framework, because it's not the overall framework. Because at the beginning when I started the process, even with Kingdom agenda setting framework, Kingdom framework, I wanted to analyze all the framework, but then without knowing that, you know, having the data to sustain all the different pieces of the framework would have been really difficult, because I have to keep just the unit creation only, but not the unit implementation, because the implementation is different parts of the framework. So advice came to just limit it some piece of the framework and make sure that I describe it in the process, and also make sure that we have data to sustain the overall process. So if I have to look at, like, for the institutionalization framework, the World Bank framework, for example, when we do research to find institutionalization framework, it's really hard to find. There is a few studies with regard to and framework around a unit institutionalization. So, the one that we found relevant was the one that has been developed by the World Bank. And indeed, it's looking at what World Bank did also. They conducted you know, a documentary analysis to find other framework regarding unit institutionalization, and they couldn't find it. So it was clear that it was difficult to find. So that's why when we discovered another study developed by Rowenzi, we decided to combine them together to come up with something new that could support this kind of work in the field. So, and I remember last month getting an email from a team in UK who's also trying to implement activities in 10 countries, including Uganda, in nutrition, and they were looking for, they read our third paper about the framework, and they sent me a message to try to understand, and also they asked me to send them some of the research that I did to summarize some of the framework before I retain this one. So yeah, this is what I can say about it.
Thank you. It's nice to see how your thinking developed as you work through the studies and the frameworks become more sophisticated as you're working through them. Thank you. So I want to move and talk about some of your findings, because that's what I'm really interested in working in this area. And maybe just an open question around who do you think should be the strongest influencers in institutionalization? You talk about a number of different players.
Yes.
I'm wondering who you feel should be the main drivers in that process.
I think I would say two key main components for me that could drive the unit institutionalization. From my own experience in the health system, the first one is the financial resources. As long as you have a stable budget and enough financial resources, you can do the other thing. You can recruit people. Like the second unit is, when I discuss with people, some people was part of the program, but they say they decided to, move to different unit because there is no budget to, implement activities. So the financial budget is one of the key components. And then it has to be the most important thing around the budget, the financial resources. It has to be the state budget, because donors funding is something usually that's I would not say create problems, but they support the unit implementation. They put a lot of money to implement activities, and just because sometimes they want to address some objective, their own objective. But at the end of the process, when the government start to take the unit implementation ownership, it's become difficult because government will not put such money in the units because they have some resources and limitation, and based on what they can provide to the units, you have to use it and manage it to implement your activities. But remember, when the unit was implementing his activities under the donors funding, they was doing so many things. Then after that, reducing the activities will if they are not doing anything, some more. So the budget is something really a key component that we can highlight here.
So I want to talk a bit more about budget and donors, because I think it's really interesting. And I think there are a few things I would have brought out more strongly in the discussion. And it may just be my own bias and my own interest, but one of them I think is this role of donors and money. Because there's actually some evidence in your thesis that contradicts what you just said. And I'd be interested to ask a bit more. So if I've understood the two units, the health camps and the fighting non-communicable diseases, actually the one that was successful didn't have a deadline,
yes,
and the one that failed did. So would you agree then that the donors are, even though they may not be the institutionalization of the end process, they may not be there, but actually that they're really important, building all the way up to that point where the line comes in?
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yes, that's true. And I remember when I started this work preparation, one of our co-students told me that there is a contradiction here, but in reality, it's like, yes, even donors, when they're supporting the country, something in the country, they usually talk to the government and say, look, we are just here for some period. So you need to start thinking about how you're going to, move forward when we stop our financial support. And sometimes also because through donor funding, usually they recruit personnel to support the units, but they also want the unit to continue with the same personnel because they had some unit activities implementation background. So government cannot just hire some new staff from government staff who will start from the beginning again without any background on the unit implementation. So that's why usually they are advising the government to start thinking about it. And then thinking about it means, starting to revise the way they are implementing the activities, because government will not pay any workers that has been hired by the donors the same salary. It has to be in line with what the government is providing. They will not pay you more than what the state budget line could provide, because there is a regulation that goes beyond the Ministry of Health itself. It's a national process and they have to follow the rules. Budget allocation mechanism also is that with donors' money, you might use it very quickly to collect data, analyze the data. But with the donor government money, you can't do that, because they will just tell you that you have your salary, use your salary, and then use the other staff in the units to collect the data with no additional cost. But then analyze it and produce the same results. And that's where problems start, because those workers that was paid by the donors, they will start looking for jobs somewhere else. And then the unit will start getting in trouble because of the way they have to restart again.
So I think there's something really interesting going on with how donors, the role donors play. And somewhere in your thesis, you have some really valuable insights that are worth collating and pushing back to the donors. And so, as I understand the data from your thesis, they play a really important role in idea generation, which I hadn't thought of before, and I think is very striking. They also they play a role in ensuring in that health accounts unit, setting frameworks, ensuring that the data is collected. Actually, all of them are mentored that seems to contribute to its success.
Yeah.
And then there's that risk that they pull out, and the need for state intervention. And the salary issue that you highlight, I think, is true across the continent. And this is a real threat for our work. I think most of us here have some element of donor funding supporting what we're doing. And we need to somehow, I think there would be huge value, whether it's in another paper or as part of an amendment, but there would be huge value in teasing this issue out a bit more in order to be able to actually make a difference. Because the institutionalization of these units and the rapid response units and the work that many of us are doing, it's actually threatened by the complexity of the role that the donors play. Because they build an expectation and then they withdraw staff and all of these kind of things. And in fact, from your findings, they're generating ideas. They're really influencing in key places. So whatever the strength of the ministry and the existence of the budget line, there's a whole issue. I was even struck when you talk about, later in your thesis, on page 133, you talk about how the donors and development partners didn't want, and sorry, I'm assuming they're the same people, but I might not be right. They didn't want to be interviewed because they said they didn't play a role. Yes.
It's the way donors are usually organized, especially in Burkina, they don't usually talk directly to the government. They have, like, among them, someone that will be their voice. Either like the head of UNICEF team will be the one talking, like, for this year for donors. Next year it will be like the head of the World Health Organization team talking to the government directly. So if there is something, other donors will walk through it, provide the ideas, and that specific person will talk directly to the government. So if it is like the UNICEF who is like in charge of talking directly to the government this year, and now that among your key players that you want to interview are people from UNFPA or World Health Organization, they will not really talk directly to you. They will ask you to go to the unit. They will say, okay, we provided everything to this technical unit. Go and talk to them. That's because, if something happened later, they don't want to be responsible for that. As oftentimes when you see some of the documents that donors usually fund, they have a disclaimer somewhere saying that, okay, this is the researcher thought. We just provide the money, but we are not behind what has been provided as an idea in these documents. So I think it can be the same issue, but I'm sure that they play key roles inside. It's like when you look at some of the activity that has been introduced in the health system, most of them usually, we are asking sometimes policymakers if they implemented the idea through evidence that they've read by themselves. But in reality, they don't have this time to read it. They usually get it from donors. The ideas come from donors, and the financial support comes from donors, and then they start building up and then push it forward. That's how it's usually happened, especially in Burkina.
So I understand why it's something you couldn't tackle, and maybe it's a piece of work for somebody else in the future, maybe even an insider in that community. But I think from your findings, you have a really strong challenge to say back to the funders, you are playing a role, and we need to understand it, because it's not just, you're not just hidden, and you're not just giving money. There's something much more powerful going on it's hard to get to the bottom of, but I suspect institutionalization, facilitating institutionalization will rely on better understanding of what's going on behind those closed doors. Another thing that I picked up on in your findings, which I'm not sure comes through, but I'd be interested to hear what your ideas are. And it's something to do, it comes down to the idea that I think maybe those of us who want to support better evidence-based decision-making and better institutionalization maybe need to be better at PR and marketing, public relations and marketing. You hinted that the government perspectives on how the unit is doing are important. And on the pressure that was put on one of the units because the data wasn't good enough, and it was beginning to be embarrassing. So somewhere, none of us are very good at it, I think, as academics, because we think we're terribly clever and therefore people should listen to it because we're clever. But actually, I wonder if we shouldn't be better at our marketing. This is, pushing the key messages, the benefits, the lessons, in order to sell what we're doing. You even said in one of your comments and presentation that the good leaders are the ones who can sell their activities. What role do you think that might play? Do you think I'm right that that's a gap? That is
yes, yes, you're totally right. We hope this kind of study could be something that government usually will, some of the key players will really read and start picking up some ideas and implement it and support it in the health system. But yes, you're totally right. They can use some of the idea that we propose here and push some key issue in the health system. I can't say with confidence that they usually read this kind of study and implement it, but from what we did in this research, what I can say is that the government took the rapid response unit's ownership, and it's not called a rapid response unit. It's a new name, but to implement that new unit, to interact like the rapid response units, they've used the papers that we published to start the discussion and the implementation process. And as we say that it has to be linked at the higher level, they decided to link the new unit directly to the Minister of Health office, so that they are head of many different units in the health system, and they started to implement the process with a state budget line first, and then now they are getting support from donors and other support coming from other sides.
So you've done a good sales job.
I hope so.
I'm sure other people do. I was really interested in the fact that you interviewed people and they told you not to write it down. And I realize we're being recorded, so you're on record now. I understand if you can't share information. But I was wondering what's missing, what you weren't able to write down. And I'm wondering if how you feel, whether there was anything you feel was particularly important that people shared, that those of us who are working in a similar environment actually really need to know.
Yeah, okay, so let me just give one example. The unit that we anonymize the name is like, you may see that it might be the same concern for even in Uganda and other countries. Like most of non-communicable diseases programs are oftentimes programs that are suffering in the health system. And then among most of the non-communicable disease, we have some particular diseases where programs whereby there is no one who is like pushing for it. They wait until one donor will now start raising the voice because of some of the bad indicators that that disease is driving, and then the government will start talking about it. So these are kind of a program, you know, and like the way we decided to anonymize the unit name is because the key leader of that unit, you know, he's a professor. He's a professor, and it's difficult for some of the unit technical workers to talk directly to him, to tell him that this is the way he should do things, because of, you know, the way we interact in the health system, especially in Africa, is that it's sometimes difficult to, you know, show something to a professor. I'm sorry to say that, but
I think that's very honest. It's actually, you're making a very good case for why you should have this PhD. Because it's actually, we like to elevate the professors and not always recognize the value of understanding the system in the health environment and not in the So I want to talk about the Rapid Response Service quickly, because myself and others are working on this, and you highlight that the success of the service is actually one of its threats, because it can be the victim of its success. You start to get more requests than you can deal with, and you're failing to meet somebody's deadline, they don't call you again. How do you think we can solve that issue? Because it's a real problem. I can see it. It's happening in my inbox now, where I'm getting more requests from government colleagues than I can meet, and the threat to my team's reputation, and I hear what you're writing, your own colleagues and your work. How do you think we can modify this to stop it from damaging our work?
I think the use of evidence for policy making has to be an habit for users first, for workers in the health system, because they could have, you know, do the work by themselves by going through some of the database and getting some of the evidence to at least, you know, use it and build their own case. But, you know, sometimes when you discuss with some well-educated people in the health system, sometimes they don't really know that there is evidence that they can find through some of the databases. I was surprised when I talked to them, and I remember we conducted a study in Burkina to understand the way the maternal and child health program is using evidence to support decision making in the health system. So then what we did, we just went through some of the policy document that has been produced in the health system, and one key thing that I was looking for is what are the references. And there is a whole strategic plan, a whole strategic document. You will see there is no reference at all in the document. So, and I told them this is my starting point, because by the time you use an evidence to implement something, at least in the document you will reference it somewhere. But because it's not there, doesn't mean that they didn't use an evidence. It's because sometimes the idea came from someone who came and told them that this is a new process that you could implement. And they will start talking or writing about it without really referencing the thing very well. The second issue might be because, you know, after you get your degree, sometimes you write the reports in a simple way without going through the normal process that want you to do a literature review, reference all the documents, and then, you know, among different options, decide which one is the best option that could be used to implement. And I'm sure that sometimes government is implementing an idea, but they could have used another idea to implement strategy. Instead of implementing the one that the World Bank introduced, probably they would have used a best option. And as you know, sometimes it's a world mode whereby, you know, when they start implementing an idea in Uganda, you will see it in many other countries, but it's not really, probably the problem are not the same, but they will start implementing it.
There's some interesting processes in the government in South Africa we should talk about at a different time, where they're trying to force people, when an idea goes to cabinet, they have to present the different options and the evidence for each one. And honestly, it's about this much information, so it's not like a long literature review, but it's trying to force a process. And we don't know yet if it's going to work. So thank you. I've been really interested by your responses and had some really good feedback and dialogue. Thank you. I have one last kind of 2 or 3 questions, and it comes down to my own experience when I submitted my PhD. So I came in a room like this, and there's blue books, because mine was blue, and it's opening the windows. There's literally 3 opening the window, and there's some behind the door, and they're everywhere. And it was a very depressing day, because I realized that sometimes PhDs count for nothing. They just open the door. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about what you think the impact of this work is. And you hinted a little bit just now around the Rapid Response Service, and it'd be interesting to hear what's happened next. So maybe I should ask that first. What has happened next with regards specifically the Rapid Response Service in Burkina? Has your thesis played a role?
As I mentioned before, I was happy to see that the discussion that led to the implementation of the new unit was based on, at some point, on the work that we did. So at some point I was like discussing, even the Minister of Health sent me an email that he wants me to be the leader of that unit. So, but from my own experience, because I know it's we need support, and I could not integrate the Minister of Health if I did not get my degree, because that's the way I leave the Minister of Health, and you can't come back if you don't. You know, you have to show it before you start over. Otherwise, it's going to be, you have to justify why the government was still, you know, keeping your place, and you come back without a degree for something that you pay for. So, so I was happy to see that for the new units there was a discussion going on in the process. So, and also have I said as an impact that the government, the way like external users, for example, keep track and using some of the paper that we publish. So yesterday I was checking online to see if there is a new use of my paper to, you know, support some ongoing work somewhere, and I got an email from you know, Google Scholar saying that that was yesterday, saying that your paper has been used for, so now I have like additional use of my paper to support ongoing work.
And if, to what extent do you think your findings here would be useful to support rapid response and institutionalization outside of health?
Outside of health? I think this kind of unit could be implemented outside of the Ministry of Health. And the process has to be almost the same, because if donors come to like the Ministry of Agriculture and want to introduce a unit or a program, let's say a program in the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Agriculture, and they want the program to survive after their support, probably they have to, you know, not force the government to implement that program in the way that they want it to be, but they have to pay attention on the rules in the health system, in that department. Don't just hire people, pay them like 2,000 as a salary, while the normal salary in that department is like $200 US. So if you do that, make sure that they will not continue with the process, or probably they might continue with the unit implementation, but they will not keep those workers in the health system. So understanding the rules probably, and the long-term planning process, as we said, if they want the unit to be institutionalized in the Department of Agriculture, So they have to start the unit institutionalization process at the beginning of the process. And then probably they might not pay them a big salary. They will try to align those salary with the government salary and make sure that, you know, the way the government usually introduce unity in the system has to follow the rule. Because if you don't get a mandate and you just come and implement the unit, they will not stop you probably. But at the time your fund is finished, you will close the office because they will not take the ownership of it.
So there's some valuable lessons we can learn from this for other areas. I meant to say, by the way, to thank you for specifying in your thesis the amounts of money that this service costs, because often we miss that information. And actually, when you're thinking about doing something similar, it's really useful. So thank you. So one last question. What happens next for you?
Next for me?
Yeah. Where do you take this? You had enough and you're going to go and do something different? What happens next?
First... So, okay, I think the answer might be correct, straightforward if I know the result of this discussion first.
We'll be optimistic.
I think we have ongoing work on knowledge translation. So I'm supporting the team in the country to conduct some activities on knowledge translation through a project that we are implementing. And also because I'm doing consultancy work with different countries. From for example, I was in Mali, and I did a training on the rapid response service in Mali, and they were really interested in introducing a rapid response unit in Mali. We did the same thing in Côte d'Ivoire. I did the same training in Côte d'Ivoire, and someone in Côte d'Ivoire were also planning to come to Uganda, because I told them about the language issue. It's going to be a big issue, because if most of the papers, even in Burkina, the professor, the researcher, they publish their papers in English. So if you don't understand, you can't read a paper in English and being able to understand the key messages and translate it into French, it's going to be difficult. So that person in Côte d'Ivoire was planning to come to Uganda, but because of probably the cost and maybe it need to be like the government, a need first, then you get the support from them. Probably that might be the main reason. So I'll still be around working on the knowledge translation.
I'm very encouraged, because there are not many people who do this work, and your ability to bring in an academic analytic lens and the practical experience that you have is really unique. So I will be following with interest.
Thank you.
Thank you.